The gravel road leading up to Evelyn Vance's property was quiet, save for the dry crunch of shale beneath the tires of the county inspector's truck. For 3 years, the residents of Blackwood Ridge had looked at Evelyn's sloping 4-acre lot and seen nothing but a stubborn old woman wasting her dwindling savings on dirt. They called it Evelyn's Folly, a patch of scarred land littered with plastic irrigation tubes and 340 fragile, spindly saplings that looked more like twigs stuck in mud than a future forest. Her neighbors laughed from their pristine, manicured lawns, mocking her daily sweat. But nature operates on a ledger they couldn't see, and in exactly 48 hours, the developers who tried to price her out would realize their million-dollar mistake. To understand why a retired paralegal would spend her mornings hauling 5-gallon buckets of water uphill while her neighbors sneered from their porches, you have to look at how Blackwood Ridge used to look. 30 years ago, the valley wasn't a grid of cookie-cutter luxury estates with asphalt driveways and artificial turf. It was a dense canopy of old-growth white oak and black walnut trees, a natural drainage basin that kept the valley's topsoil locked tight. But when the county rezoned the ridge for high-density residential development in 2022, the timber companies came first. They clear-cut the hillsides, stripping the land down to its clay bedrock to make way for The Crest, a gated community of 24 premium homes. Evelyn's property sat right at the base of the steepest slope, a lone holdout against the aggressive buyout offers from Vanguard Development Group. While everyone else sold their acreage for a quick payout, Evelyn refused to budge. Her home was an old, modest cedar-clad structure built by her late husband. To Vanguard, her property was an eyesore blocking their planned southern access road. To her neighbors, who had already cashed out and bought into the new development, her refusal to sell was a personal insult that kept their property values from skyrocketing even faster. The mocking started subtly. It began with subtle comments at town hall meetings about unmaintained parcels and fire hazards. But it escalated when Evelyn bought her first batch of 80 bare root saplings from the State Conservation Forestry Extension. Her neighbor to the west, Richard Vance, no relation, but a man who made his fortune in commercial real estate and served as the president of the Crest's Homeowners Association, would stand by his chain-link fence with a morning coffee, watching Evelyn dig post holes by hand. "You're planting a tax liability, Evelyn," Richard would call out, his voice carrying across the valley. "Those things won't reach maturity before the county condemns this drainage ditch. You're 82 years old. You won't even live to see them cast a shadow." Evelyn never argued. She just wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of an old flannel sleeve, adjusted her trowel, and kept digging. She understood something about land use law that Richard, for all his commercial real estate success, had completely overlooked. When Vanguard clear-cut the upper ridge, they altered the watershed index of the entire slope. According to the state's Environmental Protection Act, any development that increases impervious surface area, like roofs, roads, and driveways, by more than 40% must construct a certified retention basin to manage stormwater runoff. Vanguard had bypassed this expensive engineering requirement by filing a minor variance claim, arguing that the natural vegetation on the remaining lower parcels would absorb the displaced water. They assumed Evelyn's land would just absorb the damage silently. They thought the mudslides and silt runoff would eventually ruin her foundation, forcing her to sell to them for pennies on the dollar. What they didn't count on was her selection of species. Evelyn didn't just plant pretty trees. Her grid of 340 trees was a mathematically calculated defense system. She planted 90 black willows along her northern property line, 70 deep-rooting swamp white oaks across the center terrace, and a dense network of river birches and bald cypresses in the low-lying basins. These weren't random choices, these were high-capacity hydrological pumps. A single mature black willow can absorb up to 250 gallons of water per day from saturated soil. For the first 2 years, the trees looked pathetic. The local kids, egged on by the casual dismissals of their parents, would occasionally throw empty soda cans into her planting rings. The HOA even filed a formal complaint with the County Code Enforcement Bureau, alleging that Evelyn's property violated the township's weed and tallgrass ordinance. They claimed her saplings were attracting pests and decreasing the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. The county sent a code enforcement officer out to her property. Evelyn met him at the gate with a neatly organized 3-ring binder. Inside were her original soil samples, her certified agricultural extension planting plan, and a copy of the state's agricultural use exemption statute. Under Section 41B of the State Code, any property actively engaged in timber cultivation or reforestation is exempt from residential height restrictions on native vegetation. Evelyn wasn't growing weeds, she was legally operating a private microforestry tract. The officer closed his notebook, apologized for wasting her time, and left. Richard was furious. He stood on his deck, looking down at her tiny trees, completely unaware that the ground beneath his own home was slowly beginning to shift. The dry summer of 2025 had masked the structural flaw of the Crest development, but the weather patterns of the valley were about to shift drastically. And the true cost of their arrogance was finally coming due. The transition from the dry summer of 2025 into the early spring of 2026 brought a record-shattering weather pattern to the valley. It began with an atmospheric river, a dense conveyor belt of moisture traveling straight from the coast and trapping itself between the ridges. For 7 consecutive days, the sky over Blackwood Ridge didn't just rain, it unleashed a relentless, steady deluge that saturated the landscape to its absolute breaking point. Up on the hill, within the gated perimeter of the crest, the wealthy homeowners felt entirely secure behind their engineered retaining walls and asphalt curbs. Richard Vance had spent the week inside his custom-built, 5-bedroom smart home, watching the storm on high-definition security cameras. He didn't care about the water pooling on the asphalt outside, he cared about prestige. To him, the storm was merely an inconvenience that delayed his weekly golf game. When he looked out his second-story window down toward Evelyn's lot, he smiled. The 4-acre parcel looked like a swamp. The 340 trees, now entering their 4th year of growth, were completely surrounded by standing water. "Her little project is finally going to drown," Richard remarked to his wife over breakfast. "The county will have no choice but to condemn the lot as an active flood hazard now. We'll finally get that southern access road built." But Richard's understanding of civil engineering was entirely superficial. He didn't understand the difference between surface accumulation and subterranean saturation. Up on the ridge, the developers had cleared away over 40 feet of topsoil and clay to flatten the home sites. In doing so, they had exposed a highly unstable layer of fractured shale and slick bedding plains. Without the deep, interlocking root systems of the old-growth oaks that had anchored that slope for centuries, there was absolutely nothing holding the upper layers of engineered fill dirt to the bedrock beneath it. Worse yet, the water retention systems designed by Vanguard Development Group were failing catastrophically. The minor variance they had used to save money meant their concrete drainage channels didn't route the water into a municipal storm sewer. Instead, they simply dumped the concentrated runoff into a series of shallow gravel trenches right above Evelyn's property line. As the rain fell hour after hour, those trenches overflowed, turning the steep hillside into a massive, heavy sponge. Down below, Evelyn Vance stood on her back porch, dressed in a yellow slicker and heavy rubber boots. She wasn't panicked, she was observing. Armed with a clipboard protected by a clear plastic sheet, she was logging the water levels at various marker stakes she had driven into the mud years ago. While her neighbors saw a disaster, Evelyn saw a beautifully functioning machine. Her 340 trees were no longer the fragile twigs they had been 4 years ago. The swamped white oaks had sent down massive taproots deep into the lower clay strata, acting like thousands of natural steel rebar rods anchoring her soil in place. Meanwhile, the black willows and river birches along the northern boundary had matured into a dense, interlocking subterranean matrix. Their roots had spread laterally, weaving together to form a highly porous, living wooden dam. More importantly, the trees were waking up for the spring. Their vascular systems were fully active, pulling hundreds of gallons of water out of the saturated ground every single hour and releasing it harmlessly into the atmosphere through transpiration. While the soil on the upper ridge was liquefying under the immense weight of the water, the soil on Evelyn's property was holding its structure perfectly, packed tight by the dense root network. On the night of the 8th day, the rain finally stopped, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence that hung over the valley. It was 3:15 a.m. when a low, subaudible rumble woke Richard Vance from his sleep. It wasn't thunder, it was the sound of earth tearing itself apart. Richard ran to his window and turned on his exterior floodlights. What he saw made his blood run cold. The pristine, manicured sod of his 2-acre backyard was splitting open. A jagged fissure, over 3 feet wide, was ripping across his lawn. As he watched in absolute horror, his expensive infinity-edge swimming pool cracked directly down the center, tilting sharply toward the cliff edge. The entire southern slope of the crest was sliding. Because the developers had stripped the mountain and ignored the hydrological impacts, the weight of the waterlogged soil was pushing millions of tons of earth downward. The luxury homes at the top of the ridge were built on a foundation that was literally liquefying beneath them. By 6 a.m., the emergency evacuation sirens were blaring through the valley. 4 of the multi-million-dollar homes along the ridge line had been red-tagged by county structural engineers. The main asphalt access road into the crest had collapsed into a canyon of broken pavement and mud, leaving the residents entirely cut off from the main highway. The only part of the hillside that hadn't collapsed was the massive, wedge-shaped section of land directly behind Evelyn Vance's home. Her 340 trees had caught the slide. The roots had anchored the base of the hill so securely that they acted as a structural toe wall, preventing the entire mountain from burying the lower valley. Her trees hadn't just survived, they had saved her home, and ironically, they were the only thing keeping Richard's house from sliding completely off the cliff. By noon that day, the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting a harsh light over the devastated landscape of Blackwood Ridge. The contrast between the two properties was stark and undeniable. Up on the hill, the crest looked like a war zone. Heavy machinery from the County Emergency Management Agency was parked along the fractured edge of the asphalt, their yellow lights flashing uselessly against the mud. Luxury SUVs were trapped in driveways that now angled precariously toward the ravine. Down below, Evelyn's 4-acre plot stood as a vibrant, green sanctuary. The water that had pooled there hours before was rapidly draining away, sucked down into the deep root systems of her thriving microforest. The black willows and swamp white oaks stood tall and unbroken, their trunks coated in a thin layer of silt, but their structures completely unyielding. They had formed a literal wall of wood and roots that had caught thousands of tons of sliding topsoil from burying her home. Richard Vance stood at the edge of his ruined property, surrounded by county inspectors, structural engineers, and representatives from Vanguard Development Group. The atmosphere was thick with tension and panic. The engineers were reviewing topographies on their tablets, their faces grim. The retaining walls didn't just fail, the lead county engineer explained, pointing a gloved finger down toward the slope. They were completely undermined because the subsoil liquefied. Look at the grading plans from 2022. Vanguard claimed the lower parcels would act as a natural discharge zone. But you guys clear-cut the entire upper canopy, which tripled the runoff velocity. Richard, his expensive leather boots caked in thick, yellow mud, looked desperate. Can't we just pour concrete piers? Stabilize the slope from above? With what money, Richard? One of his neighbors snapped. Visibly trembling. Our homeowners insurance has an exclusion clause for landslides and earth movement unless it's caused by an earthquake. The adjusters are already denying the claims. They're saying this is a civil engineering failure, not an act of God. The lead engineer shook his head. You can't anchor concrete into shifting shale. The only way to stabilize the upper ridge now, and prevent the remaining 12 homes from being condemned, is to secure the toe of the slope. And the toe of this slope belongs to Evelyn Vance. Richard looked down the hill at the neat, thriving grid of 340 trees. The very project he had spent 4 years mocking, the woman he had tried to fine out of existence using HOA code violations, was now the only entity holding his foundation together. If Evelyn's land gave way, the rest of the hill would slide within weeks. A meeting was hastily called at the county administration building the following morning. Evelyn arrived early, carrying her familiar 3-ring binder. She sat quietly at the long oak table, dressed in a neat wool blazer, looking every bit the seasoned paralegal she used to be. Moments later, Richard Vance, the Vanguard legal team, and the county commissioners filed into the room, their expressions heavy with exhaustion. Vanguard's lead attorney didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened a folder and pushed a document across the table toward Evelyn. Ms. Vance, under the current emergency declaration issued by the county, Vanguard Development Group is prepared to offer you an immediate buyout of your property for $450,000. This is well above market value for a 4-acre parcel in a drainage zone. We need immediate, unrestricted access to the land to bring in heavy grading equipment and build a concrete terrace. Evelyn didn't even pick up the paper. She didn't look at the number. She simply looked at the attorney through her reading glasses. Your offer is insufficient, and your proposed solution is legally non-viable, Evelyn said calmly. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of someone who spent 30 years reading the fine print that other people ignored. Ms. Vance, this is a public safety crisis, Richard interrupted, his voice cracking with emotion. Our homes are quite literally hanging over a cliff. If you don't let them grade that land, we lose everything. You should have thought about that in 2022, Richard, when you signed off on the minor variance that diverted your stormwater directly onto my property line, Evelyn replied, pulling a document from her binder. I have here the certified hydrological reports from the State Forestry Extension, dated 3 years ago. I sent a copy to your HOA board and to Vanguard's corporate office via certified mail. In that notice, I explicitly warned you that stripping the old-growth canopy would destabilize the upper shale layers. The Vanguard lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, looking down at their legal pads. They realized right then that Evelyn wasn't just an eccentric old woman planting trees, she had been building a legal paper trail for 4 years. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, under the State Environmental Protection Act, specifically the Reforestation and Watershed Protection Amendment of 2024, my property has been officially designated as a protected microforestry conservation zone. You cannot bring heavy grading equipment onto this land. To do so would violate state environmental law, exposing Vanguard to automatic triple damages for timber trespass and habitat destruction. Every single one of my 340 trees is legally protected. The room fell completely silent. The developers had spent years trying to find a legal loophole to force Evelyn out. Only to find that she had woven a web of state environmental protections around her land that no corporate lawyer could break. She had used their own weapon, the law, to completely checkmate them. The silence in the county administration room was so absolute you could hear the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Vanguard's lead attorney stared at the copy of the 2024 Reforestation and Watershed Protection Amendment that Evelyn had placed on the table. He knew the statute. More importantly, he knew that timber trespass in this state carried a mandatory criminal penalty if a protected conservation zone was intentionally disrupted by corporate machinery. They couldn't bulldoze her trees, and they couldn't buy her out for pennies. Richard Vance buried his face in his hands. His entire life savings, along with the equity of 23 other wealthy families, was tied up in a hillside that was slowly creeping toward total structural failure. What do you want, Evelyn? Richard whispered, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. You've got us cornered. Just tell us what it's going to take to save our homes. Evelyn closed her binder with a deliberate, soft click. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stated her terms like a banker reading a foreclosure notice. First, Evelyn said, Vanguard Development Group will dissolve the minor variance agreement they filed with the county. You will immediately fund and construct a fully engineered subterranean municipal storm sewer line that routes all water from the crest away from the hillside entirely, connecting it directly to the valley's main drainage infrastructure. You will not dump a single drop of your runoff onto my land ever again. Vanguard's attorney quickly calculated the cost in his head. That's a 6-figure civil engineering project. It will take months to get permits. Then you had better start digging today. Evelyn replied smoothly. Because my second condition is non-negotiable. Vanguard and the Crest's Homeowners Association will sign a legally binding, permanent conservation easement over the entire southern slope of the ridge. You will deed that land over to the State Forestry Extension as a permanent green belt. No more luxury expansions. No more clear-cutting. The mountain will be allowed to grow back. Richard looked at the Vanguard team, hoping for a loophole, but the company's chief engineer gave a grim nod. Without that easement and the drainage overhaul, the county would officially revoke the occupancy permits for the entire development by the end of the week. The property values of the Crest would drop to zero overnight. And what about your property? The Vanguard lawyer asked, his pen hovering over his legal pad. What do we owe you for the structural stabilization your microforest is currently providing to our project? Evelyn smiled a small, sharp smile. You will pay a civil mitigation fee of $150,000 to the State Reforestation Fund, earmarked specifically for the ongoing care, maintenance, and expansion of my 4-acre tract. Furthermore, the HOA will issue a formal, written apology to be published in the township newsletter, retracting every single code violation and nuisance complaint filed against me over the last 4 years. Richard Vance swallowed hard. It was a complete and total surrender. The very woman they had mocked, the neighbor they had tried to drive out with fines and legal threats, was now dictating the future of their entire community. He looked at the paperwork, realized he had absolutely no leverage, and nodded. "We'll sign," Richard said quietly. 3 days later, the contract was finalized. The heavy yellow excavators that Vanguard had brought to the valley didn't roll onto Evelyn's land to destroy her forest. Instead, they were forced to work up on the ridge, digging deep trenches into the asphalt roads of the crest to install the massive concrete storm sewers they should have built 4 years ago. Evelyn watched the construction from her back porch, a hot cup of tea in her hand. The valley was loud with the sound of diesel engines and breaking stone, but down on her 4 acres, the air was clean and fresh. The ground beneath her feet was solid, dry, and perfectly anchored by the roots of her 340 trees. The news of Evelyn's victory spread quickly through the county. The local newspaper ran a front-page feature detailing how a retired paralegal's calculated agricultural strategy had prevented a multi-million-dollar structural catastrophe. The teenagers who had once thrown trash into her planting rings now rode their bikes past her gate slowly, looking at the growing forest with a sense of genuine awe. But the true transformation was happening within the dirt itself. The 4-year-old trees were no longer just saplings struggling to survive, they had officially crossed the threshold into a self-sustaining ecological canopy. The river birches had grown over 15 feet tall, their silver-peeled bark catching the afternoon sun. The deep-rooting oaks had established an underground network that acted like a massive sponge, naturally regulating the groundwater levels of the entire lower valley. Evelyn had built a living, breathing fortress, and the entire town was finally beginning to understand its value. By the autumn of 2026, the scarred landscape of Blackwood Ridge had finally begun to heal. The massive concrete drainage lines engineered by Vanguard Development Group were fully operational, buried deep beneath the repaired asphalt of the upper gated community. The immediate danger of a catastrophic landslide had passed, but the financial and social reality of the valley had changed forever. Up on the hill, property values within the crest had plummeted by nearly 40% due to the public disclosure of the structural risk. Potential buyers were no longer interested in manicured, artificial turf, they wanted structural security. The wealthy homeowners who had once looked down on Evelyn's property with open disdain now found themselves looking at her thriving microforest as the single most critical asset protecting their investments. Richard Vance's custom smart home was no longer a symbol of unassailable prestige. The jagged crack across his backyard had been filled with structural grout, and his cracked infinity pool had been completely filled in with gravel and converted into a drainage garden. Every morning, Richard would stand on his deck, looking down at the 4-acre sanctuary below. He no longer carried a smug smirk or a cup of coffee meant for mocking. Instead, his gaze was heavy with the quiet realization that his entire lifestyle existed solely by the grace of the woman he had tried to ruin. Down below, Evelyn Vance's property had become a living classroom. The state forestry extension, utilizing the $150,000 mitigation fund paid out by Vanguard, had installed a modest, low-impact gravel walking path through the center terrace of her land. It wasn't a public park, but a certified agricultural research station. Scientists from the state university arrived weekly to measure the soil density and root expansion of her 340 trees. Their findings were revolutionary for regional civil planning. Evelyn's calculated grid had managed to completely reverse 4 years of severe topsoil erosion in less than 90 days following the atmospheric river event. The root systems of the swamp white oaks had reached a subterranean depth of nearly 20 feet, binding the fragile shale layers to the deep bedrock with a tensile strength that outmatched any synthetic retaining wall. Evelyn herself didn't change her routine. She still woke up at dawn, dressed in her worn denim overalls and work boots, walking the paths of her forest with a pair of pruning shears. But she was no longer alone in her labor. The local high school's agricultural club had volunteered to help maintain the tract, learning firsthand how nature could be used to solve complex engineering challenges. The teenagers who once mocked Evelyn's folly were now carefully mapping the growth of the river birches, their voices filled with respect as they worked under her quiet direction. One crisp October afternoon, Richard Vance walked down the gravel road to Evelyn's gate. He didn't come with legal notices, code enforcement officers, or corporate attorneys. He came alone, carrying a small, heavy burlap sack. Evelyn was standing near the northern boundary, checking the bark of a mature black willow, when she heard the gate latch click. She turned calmly, watching Richard approach. He stopped a few feet away, looking visibly older, his shoulders slightly hunched. He looked around at the towering canopy of trees that had once been nothing but twigs in the mud. The leaves were turning vibrant shades of gold, amber, and deep crimson, casting long, peaceful shadows across the solid earth. "Evelyn," Richard said, his voice entirely devoid of his former arrogance. "I brought you something. It's an old-growth white oak sapling. A real one. I had it sourced from a heritage nursery upstate." Evelyn looked at the small tree in the burlap sack, then up at Richard's face. She saw no malice left in him, only the deep, humbled regret of a man who had finally learned the true value of the ground he stood upon. "Put it by the eastern terrace, Richard," Evelyn said softly, pointing toward a sunlit gap in the canopy. "The soil there is deep, and the roots will find the water they need." Richard nodded, picking up a shovel that was resting against a nearby fence post. For the first time in 4 years, he didn't stand by and laugh. He bent his back, broke the earth, and began to dig, contributing his own sweat to the living fortress that had saved them all. Nature had settled the ledger. The mockery had turned to regret, and the regret had finally turned to reverence. The 340 trees stood tall, their roots locked deep within the heart of the mountain, a permanent monument to a woman who saw the future when everyone else could only see the dirt. The addition of that final heritage oak marked a quiet turning point for the entire valley of Blackwood Ridge. It was no longer a story of a neighborhood divided by fences and arrogance, but a story of a community that had been fundamentally reshaped by the earth beneath their feet. The lesson of Evelyn Vance's microforest didn't stop at the property line, it began to influence civil planning across the entire county. Local municipalities tore up old zoning templates and began mandating natural watershed preservation for all new residential developments. The era of reckless clear-cutting on the ridges was officially over. As winter approached, the leaves of the 340 trees fell away, carpeting the ground in a thick, protective layer of rich organic matter. Even without their summer foliage, the trees looked majestic. Their bare branches stretched toward the sky like an intricate, interlocking net of dark wood, while their roots remained locked in their silent, eternal work below. The mountain had stabilized completely. The shifting shale had found its anchor, and the structural integrity of the hillside was no longer in question. Richard Vance continued his weekly walks down the hill, not out of legal obligation, but out of a new sense of responsibility. He had joined the county's conservation board, using his real estate background to advocate for sustainable land use practices. He often stood with Evelyn on her back porch, looking out over the landscape they had both, in very different ways, helped to shape. The corporate greed that had once threatened to bury the valley had been thoroughly defeated, replaced by a living legacy that would endure for generations. Evelyn's story became a powerful testament to the impact a single, determined individual can make when armed with patience and truth. She had faced the laughter of her neighbors, the aggressive tactics of corporate developers, and the bureaucratic weight of biased local codes. Yet, she had never wavered. She understood that while human arrogance can build structures of glass, steel, and asphalt, it is ultimately nature that dictates the survival of those structures. Today, if you drive past Blackwood Ridge, you won't see Evelyn's Folly. You will see a towering, vibrant sanctuary of wood and life known officially as the Vance Conservation Tract. It stands as a beautiful, green barrier between the excess of the upper ridge and the peace of the lower valley. It is a place where the air is always a few degrees cooler, the soil is always rich and deep, and the birds have finally returned to build their nests. The 340 trees have grown thick and strong, their trunks bearing the scars of past storms but their canopy reaching higher into the light with each passing year. They stand as a permanent reminder to anyone who looks upon them that the truest victories are not won with loud arguments or aggressive wealth, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of patience, foresight, and a deep respect for the land. The valley had learned its lesson, the ledger was permanently balanced, and Evelyn's forest would continue to stand guard over the mountain long after the concrete up above had crumbled back into dust.